I want you to pause for a moment. Not because this is another headline about Donald Trump, but because what just happened inside a federal courtroom cuts much deeper than one man, one post, or one fine. I have watched courtrooms for decades. Judges argue, lawyers posture, defendants test limits. But this was different. A federal judge did not issue a warning. She did not negotiate. She drew a line, and she did it publicly, deliberately, and with consequences attached. A former president was told in plain language that a court order is not a suggestion. That defiance has a cost, and that the next violation could mean jail. If you think this is about personality or politics, you're missing the point. This moment is about whether the rule of law still has teeth when power pushes back. If you care about accountability in a democracy, stay with me, because what comes next explains why this confrontation matters far beyond this case. And to understand that, we have to step back and look at how we got here. What we're really witnessing here is not a scandal. It's a stress test. The American legal system was designed for defendants who fear consequences. It was never designed for someone who treats court orders as political obstacles, not binding law. At the center of this case is a simple question with enormous implications. Can a courtroom still control a defendant who commands millions of followers, dominates news cycles, and turns every restriction into a rallying cry? This judge wasn't reacting to one post. She was responding to a pattern, a long history of pushing, violating, and daring the system to respond. Protective orders exist for a reason. They protect witnesses. They protect juries. They protect the integrity of trials themselves. When those orders are ignored, the issue is no longer free speech or legal strategy. It becomes an institutional crisis. Because if court authority collapses in high-profile cases, it collapses everywhere else too. And to understand why this confrontation became unavoidable, we need to look at how this case was built, step by step, long before that explosive moment in court. That story begins months earlier. This case did not spiral out of control overnight. It was constructed carefully, deliberately, and with restraint. From the very beginning, the court understood the risks. A defendant with an enormous platform, a case involving classified material. Witnesses whose safety depended on discretion, not spectacle. That is why the protective order mattered so much. It wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. The judge laid out clear boundaries, what could be said, what could not, what evidence was sealed, which names were off limits, and Trump's legal team acknowledged those rules in writing. No confusion, no ambiguity. For a time, the system held. Trump hovered near the edge, posting statements that tested limits but avoided crossing them outright. It was a familiar dance pressure without collapse. But here's the reality most people miss. Protective orders only work if the court believes escalation will be respected. Once that assumption breaks, patience becomes weakness. And that's exactly what happened next when boundary testing turned into open defiance and the system was forced to respond. That moment didn't just change the tone of the case, it triggered the first real crisis. Then the line was crossed. Not quietly, not accidentally, but in a way that left no room for interpretation. On December 10th, Trump didn't flirt with the boundary. He shattered it. Posts appeared that did exactly what the court had forbidden. A confidential witness was named. Details of sealed, classified material were discussed publicly. Screenshots, timestamps, and side-by-side comparisons made denial impossible. This is where many viewers misunderstand the gravity. Violating a court order isn't a political misstep. It's not messaging strategy. For ordinary defendants, it's a fast track to handcuffs. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors didn't argue hypotheticals. They displayed the posts. They read the order aloud. They let the contrast speak for itself. And when the judge compared the language line by line, something shifted. The room went silent because the facts were no longer debatable. If you're finding this analysis clarifying, pause for a second and stay with me. What happened next explains why this moment was inevitable. Because once defiance becomes public and undeniable, the system has only two choices: back down or strike back. What happened next reveals the mechanism most people never see. Courts don't rely on outrage. They rely on escalation. Protective orders are the first barrier. Contempt findings are the second. Custodial sanctions jail are the last line of defense. This structure exists for one reason. Some defendants aren't deterred by warnings. Some aren't deterred by fines. Especially wealthy, high-profile defendants who can absorb penalties without changing behavior. Trump has operated inside that gap for years. Fines become noise. Warnings become fuel. Public defiance becomes part of the strategy. The judge understood this. Her ruling wasn't emotional. It was mathematical. If fines don't work, they stop being punishment. They become permission. That's why the language shifted. Not to humiliation, to authority. By stating that the next violation could lead to custody, the court wasn't escalating theatrics. It was restoring leverage, because a legal system without leverage is just a suggestion box. And once that leverage is placed on the table, everything changes, not just for the defendant, but for everyone watching. That's when the second crisis began to form, because power reacts differently when consequences become real. The tension peaked when consequences stopped being theoretical. The judge didn't just rule. She confronted in open court. She walked through the order line by line. Then she matched it against Trump's own words. Not interpretations, not arguments. Exact language, exact posts. There was nowhere to hide. When the contempt finding was announced, it landed hard. 5 violations, $250,000 in fines, but the number wasn't the point. The warning was, the judge made it unmistakably clear that this courtroom would not absorb defiance indefinitely. That status does not dilute authority, and that the next violation would trigger something far more serious than money. Custody. That single word changed the balance of power in the room, because fines can be dismissed, but jail cannot. For the first time, Trump's legal strategy collided with a limit it couldn't spin away. Lawyers stopped arguing and started containing. The courtroom shifted from spectacle to control. This wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about whether the system could still enforce obedience when challenged by someone who had never truly been forced to comply. And that question doesn't stay inside courtrooms. Because when power meets restraint, ordinary people are always caught in the outcome. Now, this is where it reaches you. Because when court orders are treated as optional by the powerful, the cost never stays confined to a courtroom. It spreads outward. If you're an ordinary citizen, you don't get warnings like this. You don't get repeated chances. You don't get fines that feel abstract. You comply or you lose your freedom. So when you watch a defendant test limits again and again, what you're really seeing is a double standard being challenged in real time. And that matters, whether you support Trump or oppose him. Because the moment the law bends for one person, it weakens for everyone else. Witnesses become less safe. Juries become less protected. Trust in outcomes erodes. And once that trust is gone, people stop believing rules are worth following at all. If you've ever wondered why institutions feel fragile, why confidence in justice keeps slipping, this is why moments like this matter so much. If this analysis resonates with you, stay with me. Share it with someone who thinks this is just politics. Because what happens next shows how this confrontation ripples far beyond one trial. From this point on, the impact becomes global. What happened in that courtroom didn't stay in Washington. It echoed outward. Around the world, legal systems watch how power is handled in the United States. Not because America is perfect, but because it sets tone. Signals matter. When a former president openly defies court orders, allies take notes. So, do adversaries? Because the question becomes simple. Does the rule of law hold when it's inconvenient? If it doesn't, then courts everywhere become easier to pressure. Witnesses everywhere become easier to intimidate. And strong men everywhere gain another argument. This is why this ruling drew global attention. It wasn't about Trump alone. It was about whether institutions still have the capacity to say no. When judges enforce consequences consistently, they reinforce a global norm. That power submits to rules, not the other way around. But if enforcement hesitates, if threats remain symbolic, the opposite message spreads just as fast. And in a world already strained by political polarization and distrust, that message is dangerous. What comes next will determine which signal dominates. Because once authority is tested on this scale, the response shapes expectations everywhere. And that leads us to the only question that truly matters now. What happens from here? From here, the system splits into three possible paths. The first is restraint. Trump complies. Posting stops. The court maintains control without ever using custody. The system works quietly, imperfectly, but intact. This is the best outcome, not because it's gentle, but because it proves authority doesn't need to be exercised to be real. The second is escalation without enforcement. Trump violates again. The judge hesitates. Sanctions increase, but custody never comes. This is the most dangerous scenario because it teaches a lesson far beyond this case, that defiance carries noise, not consequences. And systems trained this way decay fast. The third path is confrontation. Another violation, custody imposed, a former president taken into detention, even briefly, legally justified, politically explosive, unprecedented. That moment would test not just Trump, but public faith, institutional resolve, and political stability all at once. It would force the country to choose between principle and discomfort. Every system eventually faces this moment, not when rules are easy, but when enforcing them is costly. Which path we take depends on one thing, whether authority is symbolic or real. And that brings us to the final insight, the one this entire confrontation has been moving toward. Here's the truth most people avoid. This was never really about Donald Trump. It was about whether authority still functions when it's challenged by power that refuses to submit. A court order only matters if it's enforced. A rule of law only exists if it applies equally, especially when it's uncomfortable. And a democracy only survives when institutions are willing to absorb backlash in order to preserve legitimacy. This judge drew a line not to make history, but to prevent collapse. Because once courts become optional for the powerful, they become meaningless for everyone else. What happens next will tell us more than any verdict ever could. If compliance follows, authority holds. If defiance continues and consequences vanish, the erosion accelerates. And if enforcement comes, the system will be tested at a scale we've never seen before. This isn't the end of the story. It's the moment where the rules either prove they matter or reveal that they don't. If you want to understand where accountability is heading next, stay with me. Subscribe. Share this with someone who thinks institutions are abstract. Because the next confrontation won't just shape this case, it will shape how power is restrained in the years ahead.